Since this is officially the presidential panel, I get to say a few words about what I was trying to do with it before we actually begin. I'll try and be brief, but while I was thinking about what to do with this panel, and I was beginning to invite people, I received news that a very old friend and very important person in my academic and personal life had died. I think probably many of you will know her, Barbara Harlow. She may be not quite so known in cultural studies circles as in many others, but she was a scholar, an activist, critic, friend, a comrade. She was just a very important and special person. One of the things she told me, like very early in my career, which I remembered for a very long time actually, right up until today in fact. She said, she wasn't much of a kind of theory person, she wasn't much of certainly not a grand theory person. And she said, you know, that's all very well, do your theory, but remember to check your theory against other people's knowledge. That's kind of what I've tried to do with this panel today. It may not kind of quite work out in that grandiose way, but what I tried to do is kind of bring people, academic and non-academic, whose knowledge, special knowledges, might be kind of somewhat different from our own, or at least from our more settled versions of theory and analysis. And that's what I tried to do. I hope that you will find it at least interesting. Actually, more to the point, I hope they will find it interesting. And I'm going to turn this over to Mr. President.
Thank you, Paul. I'm here replacing Toby Miller, who was charged with this task. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here due to health reasons. While the title dealing with against Trump, or dealing it to Trump, if you want, keeps becoming more poignant by the moment, dealing with Trump too, especially in Roman numerals, can be scary. But let me assure you that this is not a plenary about building a Noah's Ark to survive another Trump presidency. And I don't mean the second term of the current Trump. I'm referring to the scary possibility of President Ivanka Trump, or Eric Trump, or Donald Trump Jr., or God forbid, Tiffany Trump. The range of the many issues that we might explore tonight is immense. It includes dealing with and against Trump and Trumpism in one's role as an activist, a bureaucrat, a journalist, a student, a teacher, a scholar, a woman, a minority, a foreigner, immigrant, a judge, a therapist or psychologist, or any other categories of subjectivity. If any one of you have Googled the words dealing with Trump at all recently, as I did this morning, you will have noticed that the top hits are pieces on what therapists now call Trump anxiety and how to cope with it. In fact, the top hit, at least in my search engine this morning, is a piece by therapist Jeremy Kleiman, and I would like to share with you the first two sentences of the article and the last two sentences of the article and spare you everything else. So the article goes, quote, "I'm a therapist. Since the Trump election, virtually all of my clients have added to our treatment agenda of distress a palpable and perpetual societal angst." End of the first two sentences. And the article goes on to share with people tactics and strategies of coping with Trump, and closes in with sarcastic tone, quote, "You can't resolve that which you avoid. Bottom line prescription, take 2 Advil and call me in 4 years." End of quote. Or you could just take 2 Tic Tacs. What is Don Hidrick? Is Don Hidrick here? So yesterday, Don Hidrick handed out, as part of his plenary presentation, resistance, what he's calling resistance Tic Tacs for people who weren't here, and it's my understanding that he has some more to hand out later today. So you could just take those two resistant stick tacks and listen to what our capable speakers have to say, and I have no doubt that they will help stimulate a discussion with all of us that is both lively and endowed with facts and also opinions. The kinds of issues we might discuss are wide-ranging and can include, among other things, a discussion of such questions as surveillance, the intelligence services, foreign relations, healthcare, public opinion, elections, sexuality, race, class, gender, queerness, impeachment, President Pence, President Ryan, adding to that earlier list, the Republican Party's fissures, the midterms, false news, the post-truth era, cable news, tweets, Camp David, resistance stick tacks, they're there too, or indeed many other matters. Given the last few months, I really think that the conversation has to be open and multi-perspectival. And I really appreciate Paul Smith, the real President Smith, attempt in organizing the two plenaries on Trump, yesterday's and today's, to strike what I think is a fine but difficult balance between robust intellectual work and political activist work, bringing folks engaged in either or both to our gathering. Part of what makes the balance difficult to strike is the fact that while activist work and intellectual work do and should intersect, do and should need each other, they also operate with different temporalities and logics. Having taken a necessary detour through critical theory yesterday, to use a phrase from Marx, there you go, I have to mention Marx at least once, even in a one-page document. I have to mention, so we hope to highlight some of the concrete political activist work being done to deal with and against Trump. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Christopher Bonner, who's an assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland. He specializes in African American history, particularly black protests in the early United States, as he's currently at work on a manuscript titled The Price of Citizenship, which examines black activists' effort to construct American citizenship before the passage of the 14th Amendment. He's more broadly interested in the roots and results of radical politics, the nature and meanings of historical violence, and the creation of black freedom in a slaveholding republic. Christopher Bonner.
Thank you. I have a computer here, so I'm not gonna disrupt anything here. Well, I guess disruption might be good. Is that? So, good afternoon, folks. This is my first time here with the Cultural Studies Association, so I'm glad to have a chance to talk with you guys today about I guess about Trump from my perspective. So, as you heard, I teach African American history. I'm interested in the 19th century, and so that's the sort of angle that I'm coming at this from. And so what I want to do today is look back a little bit, look back at some of the ways Trump's politics reflect earlier projects in American history, and also look forward to think about what this means for us, and also how we might confront, how we might deal with these meetings. Donald Trump entered political conversations. He entered conversations on national politics in 2011 when he started repeating claims that Barack Obama was not born in the United States and that he therefore could not legally be president. Demands to see the birth certificate of the first black president were part of a project of defining the nation in racial terms. And this project of exclusion based on race or ethnicity has been central to Trump's presidency. We can see roots of what's called the birther movement in the work of the American Colonization Society, the ACS, which was founded in 1816. Colonization, as the ACS pursued it, was about making plans, raising funds, and passing laws to remove black people from the United States. ACS leaders said that racial prejudice made it impossible for black and white people to live together in the US, and their solution to the problem of prejudice was to get rid of black Americans. Black activists called the ACS the deadliest foe of the colored race. They saw that it was a threat to their lives as Americans, and they said that colonization was fundamentally unjust because it was designed to remove free American citizens from the country. As they argued that through the work of the ACS, black people could be deprived of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in their native land. And so colonization like the birther movement and like Trump's arguments for a border wall, was built on a lie that too many people had come to believe. The lie in the case of colonization was that it would be sending black people back to Africa. And of course, in the 19th century, the vast majority of black Americans had been born in the United States. They felt like, and they were, American people. They didn't have homes or connections in West Africa. So denying black Americans a place in the country in the 19th century was an attack on the emotional connection that human beings feel to their home. But black people also understood that there were more tangible problems or injustices that could come from colonization. In the 1820s and 30s, states like New York and Pennsylvania passed laws that prevented black men from voting, and other lawmakers in other states proposed measures to prohibit black people from living in their states. So colonization encouraged people to believe that black Americans weren't truly Americans and that they therefore didn't deserve rights or protections. And again, black people are standing up, denouncing the ACS, but the organization endured for decades. And part of how it endures is because it has this weird coalition of supporters. Slave owners, white abolitionists, Christian missionaries, all groups of people who felt like black removal might benefit their work. And people outside of the ACS leadership came to embrace its central idea, its central claim. In August of 1862, as Americans began to reckon with the horrific scale of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln held an infamous meeting where he invited 5 black ministers to the White House, and he asked them to encourage other African Americans to voluntarily leave the country. Lincoln said to these men, among other things, "But for your race among us, there could not be war." And so removing black people, Lincoln suggested, would solve America's problems. It sounds familiar. In September 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation, that most famous of American documents, it called for Congress to find funding to remove freedmen and women from the country. And so the idea of colonization is embedded in the moment of emancipation. So Lincoln found slavery to be morally repugnant, and he worked to move the country towards ending it, but as late as 1862, he couldn't quite imagine black people as part of the United States. The people who have demanded to see the birth certificate of the first African-American president are continuing this old project, the project aimed at denying people of color equal access to the US. And Donald Trump has, of course, embraced and nurtured that project, in part by describing the so-called inner city as a war zone, by claiming that various non-white peoples are violent criminals, by issuing specific calls to bar entry to the United States on the basis of ethnicity, nationality, and religion. Trump's rhetoric and Trump's executive orders have revived work from the 19th century that was designed to develop plans, to raise funds, and to pass laws that would exclude people of color from the United States. And so this is kind of, this is just the historical angle of this, right? And thinking about this, especially like in this sort of immediate context, I think when I got an email about what we might talk about, the idea was that you could talk about the last 100 days or the last 100 hours. It's like this rapid news cycle, right? Comey's firing, the sort of day-to-day growing evidence of the corruption of the administration. It feels like this kind of talk doesn't matter that much, right? Like, what does it matter that Trump is a racist? I was talking to my girlfriend about this, and she said, yeah, in 2 weeks he might not be president anymore, right? Like, there's this feeling that this is not that important, but I do think that it's important to think about the specific racist roots of Trump's campaign and of his policy proposals. It gets us to some of the large and small scale problems of what looks like this is going to be our presidency for a while at least. So what does this mean for us? In 1866, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which was designed to provide legal protections for 4 million enslaved people who were emancipated during the Civil War. And the law, the 14th Amendment, has become the foundation of a legal system that's intended to secure equal protection and access for American people. By questioning President Obama's status, Trump and his supporters are challenging the concept at the center of this law. People seem unwilling or unable to understand that the citizenship of black and brown Americans is technically, legally, no different from the citizenship of white Americans. It was designed in 1866 to be the same. And so one of the big picture problems here, or maybe large scale problems here is that this presidency is a threat to what I think are very real inclusive possibilities of the United States. But President Trump also poses more immediate and tangible dangers. He's encouraged people to be more open and more active with their prejudices, to act in ways that deny the idea that the country should be inclusive. Early in the morning last Saturday, Richard Collins III, a 22-year-old African-American man, was killed on the campus of the University of Maryland in College Park. The suspect in the murder, as you guys have likely seen in the news, the suspect is a former UMD student who was a member of a Facebook group called Alt-Right Nation, and part of the plan, I guess, of this Facebook group was to collect racist memes, which, you know, happens all over the internet. The Diamondback, which is the student newspaper on campus, reported that this Facebook group is created in March, so it's in the heart of this moment, in the center of this moment of Trump. The killing of Richard Collins represents the enduring and multifaceted threat to African-American lives that was posed by the ACS, the threat that has been emboldened by President Trump. This is slightly distracting. So as I wrap up here, I want to think a little bit about dealing with this, right? This is the point, right? How do we deal with this? And this is also the point where I hit a kind of roadblock, right? Like, I can think about history, I can think about the meanings for us now, but it's hard for me to think about confronting these things or figure out like real plans, right? How do you confront the problem of the color line? So Trump's presidency has revived racist politics. It has encouraged people to act on their prejudices, but now what? One of the things I've been wrestling with as I'm teaching students especially is the question of like, how valuable is it to explain to them that racism now has roots in the past? Like, what does it do for them to know this? Partly the reason I'm questioning this is like, students don't necessarily need to look to the past to see minority groups being marginalized or people of color being brutalized. And so I've been thinking about the value, like how valuable this is. But I've also been wondering about the political value of calling out racism. Like, how much does it matter to someone like the man who killed Richard Collins? How much does it matter to Donald Trump? How much does it matter to one of the 60 million people who voted for him to identify racist roots of their impulses? Is shame a weapon against these kinds of people? But I think that the killing of Richard Collins does give us a sense about how we might deal with this presidency, because I think that it allows us to see very clearly what is at stake. President Trump's proposals represent a real threat to the inclusive ideal of American citizenship, and there are very clear ways that the ideas he expresses help inspire people to harm others. And too often, what I think happens here, when people talk about instances of racial violence, things like this killing at UMD, people aren't clear enough about the causes. So statements that came out in the aftermath of these events, statements from the president of the university and from the dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, both describe Collins' death as a, quote, senseless murder. And this is the problem. So the crime shouldn't be something that we can't make sense of, right? Thinking people. And the killing also absolutely makes sense in the context of US history, and it makes sense in our present context in which the most powerful man in the world is endorsing racism and endorsing violence. And so when people say that this kind of killing was senseless, essentially they're saying that the killer doesn't fit into the realm of what normal Americans do. They're saying that he doesn't really represent a larger set of problems. He's a lone wolf. He's, as the early report said, he was intoxicated. It was 3 a.m, right? And so calling this crime senseless, it really tosses out, throws out any kind of power that we might find in this act of violence. For me, the most striking thing about the election in November was seeing that 60 million people didn't think that racism mattered enough to sway their vote. They didn't think that hate was all that dangerous. But the perverse power that we have through things like the killing of Richard Collins is that we can speak to those 60 million people, and we can speak to some of the 63 million who voted for Hillary Clinton. And we can say that a politician's language really does matter in very real ways. And the way that we can do that, the only way that we can do that, is by making sense of this kind of crime, by talking about the history of American racism, talking about the ways that it endures and has been encouraged by our president. We have to be clear that for a lot of people, right now, it makes perfect sense to kill a black person simply for being a black person. And so this is what's at stake. And tragically, making sense of this killing and telling others why it makes sense to the perpetrator, that offers us one way that I think we might deal with President Trump. Thank you.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Cecilia Gingerich, who is a research associate at the Democracy Collaborative, a nonprofit that through research and diverse programs works to carry out a vision of new economic systems where shared ownership and control creates more equitable and inclusive outcomes, fosters ecological sustainability, and promotes flourishing democratic and community life. She works on the organization's Next System project, which launched in 2015 to catalyze thinking around alternative social, political, and economic structures and institutions that could potentially replace the current system. She holds a BA and MA in politics from New York University, and her recent research has focused on how we might begin to move towards gender liberation. Cecilia.
I also would like to thank the Cultural Studies Association for inviting me to speak today, and particularly for asking me to speak on this theme, dealing with Trump, since, as the introduction mentioned, I think it's forefront in all of our minds right now. And like perhaps many of you, over the past 4 months, I've been periodically been seized with fear and or panic when I remember not only that the current administration, in all likelihood, will be in power for many years to come, whether it's headed by Trump or Pence, but also that the effects of the administration's agenda are only beginning to manifest themselves. There's so much more that's likely to come to pass, and that thought can be pretty overwhelming. So on an individual level, I think one of the first steps to dealing with Trump has to be to recognize that potential to feel overwhelmed and helpless, and to make sure that we all check in with our people, our social networks, when we need to. And when we're personally feeling okay, i.e. absorbing the news without an acute sense of panic, I think it's a great idea to reach out to others in our networks and make sure that they're doing okay. One thing we can be certain about is that we aren't going through this stressful period of time alone, and I think it gives us power simply to remember that. However, I would like to focus most of my remarks on how we might deal with Trump collectively. As I'm sure has been said at this conference already many times, I think our collective response has to start with resisting the deeply harmful policies of the current government. But I also believe that we need to take this time to decide what we want instead, in terms of policies, institutions, and potentially even whole systems, because the world may look very different when we emerge from this mess, and we want to make sure we're ready to offer an alternative as soon as we're able. So I'll return to imagining and planning for the future we want in a moment, but I also want to spend a bit more time thinking about how we might resist. So first, I think it's important for us to recognize not only symptoms, but also their causes. Or in other words, that we recognize that every bill that gets passed or every budget that gets proposed has a history that extends well before Trump. His path to getting elected is a somewhat longer discussion, but it's clear that it was enabled, at least in part, by a deep dissatisfaction with the status quo from the majority of Americans. And this deep dissatisfaction was a result, again, at least in part, to living in an inherently unequal system where our security and power have been consistently eroded for decades. To give some stats, real wages for around 80% of American workers have been essentially flat for decades. And at the same time, the income share taken by the top 1% has jumped from 10% in 1980 to more than 22% today, which is the top's largest share since 1929. And even this income distribution looks almost egalitarian when compared to wealth ownership, where the top 10% of Americans now command over 3/4 of the nation's total wealth. And when taken together, the wealthiest 400 Americans have more wealth than the bottom 186 million combined. Meanwhile, 40% of American families are surviving paycheck to paycheck, with almost no savings to fall back on in the event of a job loss or other emergency. And as I'm sure has already been discussed again at this conference, many individuals and families are also burdened by significant debt, certainly myself included. And of course, the list of negative trends goes on. The life expectancy gap between rich and poor is up. The labor force participation rate has fallen steadily for the last 2 decades. The incarceration rate has more than quintupled since the 1970s. And systemic patterns of racism, sexism, and environmental degradation remain firmly entrenched. Recognizing these trends gives us insight into what is likely to come next. At best, more of the same, more austerity, greater inequality, and more environmental degradation. At worst, we'll see a significant worsening of these trends. But recognizing them can also help to advise us on how we should oppose the new government's agenda. Because it's not simply the new government's agenda, but an agenda that was built on decades of policies that came before from across the US political spectrum. The new policies are historically connected to these larger trends, and so should be consciously linked to them whenever possible. And I won't spend a lot of time on the specific ways that we can resist, though to name a few, we can back local initiatives like sanctuary cities that counter harmful federal policies. We can become more involved in local, state, or national politics, whether that's supporting progressive officials and candidates, putting pressure on current office holders, or even running for office ourselves. And especially if there's nothing else to do, we can also take to the streets and protest and partake in acts of civil disobedience. Yet at the same time that we're participating in these forms of resistance, we need to be thinking about what happens next. What happens if we manage to defend the hard-won rights that are being attacked, but also what happens if we lose more ground, as we're likely to do? From the right to vote, to organize, to dissent, to marry, to control our own bodies, or even just to be in public without fear of violence and discrimination. These are rights that we have struggled to and unfortunately often failed to secure for many years. We absolutely must defend any gains we've made, but we should also ask, beyond the basics, what do we really want? What kind of world do we want to live in? So I think it's critical that we don't allow ourselves to be forced only onto the defensive, but that we instead continue to develop, implement, and project a powerful alternative. This starts with answering the question, what do we really want? Take, for example, the Affordable Care Act. We must defend it against the current attempts to defund and/or entirely dismantle it. But we also should think strategically about what we'll do if the current government is successful. Will we fight for the ACA to be resurrected, or would we prefer to build something different in its stead? A single-payer system, perhaps. And if the latter, then I think it's critical that we have that plan ready in hand, because as the many decades and century-long trends mentioned earlier indicate, system-level change are not likely to happen on their own. And clearly, proposing a new, feasible healthcare system is not a simple thing. It requires not only that we know exactly what we want, but also that we then collectively fight for it, including pressuring those with political power to support our new proposal. But as is particularly clear in this example, doing so may be the difference of life or death for many in the future, including some of us. And so I believe it is a worthy endeavor. And this concept of deciding what we really want and then advocating for it is also applicable to so many other aspects of our current system. I suspect many here agree, for instance, that minor reforms to the nation's criminal justice system or policing methods is not enough, and we would like to see them replaced with something entirely different. But what exactly? Even if we don't all agree on the alternatives we come up with, we don't even have the ability to debate the merits of alternatives until we have developed them. Another example I'd like to mention is care work. which, though utterly essential, is currently mostly unpaid in our current system, and whether paid or not, is primarily shouldered by women and people of color. Can the current system resolve this unequal and oppressive division of labor, which it appears to be so dependent on both socially and economically? Or if we agree that it cannot, and we are not moving towards equality in this area, or even if we're just not moving towards equality quickly enough, do we have alternative avenues by which to get closer to equality? Maybe we can start with a publicly funded childcare. And then there's climate change, which is clearly an issue that can't be put on the back burner, and yet the Trump administration is determined to do so. Even if we manage to halt some of the cuts to environmental protections and the total deregulation of the fossil fuel industry, it won't be enough, because it hasn't been enough. Moreover, we're likely to be very limited in what we're able to do in this area under the current administration, since the scale of the problem is so great. So what is our plan for the day after Trump? Just as an aside, the project I work on recently put forth a proposal to use quantitative easing to buy up and phase out the largest of the fossil fuel companies, which is just one example of a big solution that we could do, but it still wouldn't be enough to mitigate this problem. And so there are many other examples of systemic problems that require large-scale systemic solutions, but I think you get the idea. It's also not merely an ideological war that I'm suggesting we wage, though I think that having a powerful alternative narrative of what the future could look like is imperative. I also think we can begin to develop and implement some alternative structures or parts of them at the local, city, or state level, or really wherever we're able. Having a city or region shift towards more renewable energy, for example, won't prevent further climate change on its own, but it can provide a powerful example that others may be able to replicate, or at very least look to for inspiration. So to recap, I think our collective response to dealing with Trump should begin by recognizing that although we're in a difficult era that is, in many ways, significantly different from the past, it also was built upon systemic trends that have existed for decades and sometimes centuries. Action-wise, we must maintain an ongoing resistance in order to preserve past gains and show solidarity with all who come directly under attack. And at the same time, I think we must also collectively craft and propose a powerful, actionable alternative vision of equality and mutual prosperity that can contrast the fear, hate, and isolation that is currently being generated. It is only through creating such an alternative vision, I believe, that we will have the ability to begin to move towards the future we want. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Carroll Doherty, who is Director of Political Research at Pew Research Center. He plays a leading role in developing the center's research agenda and overseeing editorial content about long-term trends in political values, U.S. views on policy issues and priorities, and political knowledge and news interests. He regularly provides analysis of public opinion and politics for domestic and international news outlets, including NPR, CNBC, and the BBC, and also speaks to government, academic, and business groups on these topics. Before joining Pew Research Center in 2000, he was a journalist for many years, covering congressional leadership, politics, and foreign affairs as senior writer for Congressional Quarterly and serving as an off-air investigative reporter for CBS News on foreign affairs. Carroll Doherty.
Thank you for having me. It's a very interesting panel. I really enjoyed the first two speakers. As you know, it's kind of an interesting election from my perspective. We've been in the eye of the hurricane for the past 6 months, but I'm sure you're all aware of, through your Twitter feeds or Facebook or however you get news, you're probably listening to whatever's happening right now. There's probably something I don't know about vis-a-vis the Trump presidency. But I'm gonna just quickly look at three trends we've identified as really crucial to American politics now that sort of predate Trump in some ways, but certainly shape what's going on right now. And the first of these is just the simple power of partisanship. I mean, the question we always get over and over is, when will the Trump supporters begin to crack? When will they begin to change? Are they going to, well, it's going to take a lot. As Donald Trump himself said, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and his supporters probably wouldn't abandon him. That was hyperbole, but who knows these days. And so, I mean, our data shows that Trump obviously is the most polarizing president we've seen, and certainly in my lifetime. His support among Republicans remains strong, even though his overall approval rating is the lowest of any president that we've tracked for 5 decades. But 80% of Republicans or more still support him through the first 3 or 4 months of his presidency. But as I said, this is a trend we've been watching for a while. It long predates Trump. We've seen ideological separation among the parties, growing what we call partisan antipathy. That means negative views, highly negative views among Republicans for Democrats, highly negative views the other way. And it goes beyond the parties themselves. It's towards the people in those parties. And I think that explains a little bit about where we are in politics. The second trend is that, and this touches on something Cecilia mentioned, is an era of low trust of government, but not just government, institutions. 20% say they can trust government just about always or most of the time. Again, not a new phenomenon. Didn't start with Trump, didn't start with Obama. It goes back more than a decade. And some of the contributing factors, a slow-growing economy, income inequality, you know, this idea that institutions in Washington and elsewhere can no longer deliver for average Americans. And finally, as I said, it's hard to build support, you know, for solutions in a Trump era or any other time when there's such low trust and skepticism about the ability of government to deliver. And the third phenomenon is something we've studied in quite into intimate detail, is demographic change in America. And you know, that we had long thought that this November would be the most diverse voting electorate we had ever seen. It didn't turn out that way. The country's got more diverse, but the electorate did. 73% white in 2012, 73% white or so in 2016. Now, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, as we all know, but the share of voters who were non-white did not grow over this period, even as the non-white population did grow. And I think what you see then is the limitation. You know, demographics is not destiny. We all know that. And it turned out to be particularly the case for Hillary Clinton, in the sense that this demographic change in America, which is still continuing and continues to this day and will continue, did not lift her to victory. And I think one of the factors, of course, and I think there's probably been too much attention paid to this group, but it is interesting to note that a group that is actually declining in size in the population and in the electorate proved to be so crucial on election day. These are whites who, without a college degree, the so-called white working class that we've seen so much attention paid to, who now comprise less than half of all voters. They were 63% of all voters in 1992 when Bill Clinton won his first election. But what happened among the white working class? They voted for Trump by 39 percentage points. This is extraordinary. But again, the trend isn't new. The magnitude of the Trump victory with this group is astounding. Mitt Romney run this group by 25 percentage points in 2012. But this is a group we've seen trending Republican, and it's locked in now with Trump. And I think he achieved this victory in a way that few political analysts, certainly I couldn't predict it, given the demographic changes in the country, that this would occur, that you could actually do the equivalent of a political inside straight and base your presidency, in essence, largely around one demographic group that happens to be declining as a share of the overall electorate. I mean, we can discuss how he did that, the role that possibly racism, sexism, economic anxiety has played in this. Political scientists and others have studied this issue ever since November. You know, all of these are factors, I think. That's probably the simplest explanation. But, you know, looking forward, I think, you know, you can see the opportunities there. I mean, simple voter turnout is so crucial. We saw that in 2016, 70,000 votes in 3 states would have changed the outcome of the election, even though Clinton again did win the popular vote. And going into 2018, certainly the Democrats have a little bit of hope in terms of public opinion, in terms of Trump's own approval rating. And as you see in the special elections that have been held, where they've done better in more so-called red districts in special elections. But I would say one more thing, you know, again, and this gets back to the events of the last 24 hours, proving the power of partisanship once again. The Montana special election where the newly elected congressman assaulted a reporter on the eve of that election. And it just, I think, underscores again this power of partisanship, the team mentality in American politics today, where in this case, although 2/3 of the people had voted early, among those 1/3, it wasn't enough that he had assaulted a reporter. And I think what mattered most was that he was on my team, he was part of my tribe, and that's sort of where we are in politics today. So with that, thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Tim Johnson, who is a reporter in the Washington Bureau of McClatchy, a newspaper and digital news company. He covers national and cybersecurity, and for much of the past 30 years, he's been a foreign correspondent based in Latin America and East Asia. In 2015-2016, he was part of a 3-person team at the McClatchy that spent a year delving into the Panama Papers. McClatchy was the only English language print medium in the United States involved in this project from its inception. And Johnson is also author of Tragedy in Crimson, How the Dalai Lama Conquered the World but Lost the Battle with China.
Thank you. Carroll mentioned the assault of the reporter in Montana and how little impact that made. Just before coming over here, I saw a tweet that the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, held up he was at a gun range, I believe, and he held up a bullseye and joked with the reporters that he would kill a reporter next, or something to that effect. This kind of thing is happening more and more. At our office over on Connecticut Avenue, we've had to put in special locks on the doors, and we're getting kinds of threats all the time. But the fact is that right now, for journalists at least, it's a time of peril, but it's also a time of great promise. Last week, the Washington Post had a story that drew more online hits than that story back last autumn about the Hollywood Access videotape. And the newsroom stood up and applauded because it was such an amazing moment that what we do matters. Now, I'm looking at much of this with fresh eyes because I spent basically the last 25 years overseas in China and in Latin America. And when I came back last year, shortly after I got back, there was a breach at the Democratic National Committee. Like a break-in at the Watergate complex 45 years earlier, this breach at the DNC got fairly small news attention. But of course, it grew in importance, and we've been feeling the impact since then. Today, I want to talk about breaches. I cover cybersecurity and intelligence. Breaches, cybersecurity, hacker groups like the shadow brokers, WikiLeaks, and its radical transparency in what I might call the battle over identity. Much of this is coming to a head under Donald Trump, who has introduced us to over-the-top language in his public discourse. We've all read the tweets. He lashes out at the failing New York Times, which writes total fiction. The rest of the dishonest media peddles fake news driven by, quote, blind hatred. Obama, he calls a sick guy. Of course, this discourse matters a lot. We all probably remember that point last fall where a guy drove up from North Carolina to a local pizza parlor here and with a rifle walked in there and convinced that in the basement of this pizza parlor there was a dungeon with child pedophilia rings going on. He shoots the place up, or at least fires off several shots. 126 days have passed since the Trump inaugural. The real and the mendacious commingle. Trump boasts that his administration is, quote, a fine-tuned machine. It's not exactly that, but the evidence is somewhat otherwise. Now, we know that automated pro-Trump botnets, robotic networks, helped drive his victory last fall. And US intelligence agencies tell us that a Russia-backed effort to spread fake news had an impact on the defeat. It helped lead to the defeat of Hillary Clinton. But this comes across at a time of broader commercial technological trends that I want to focus on a bit. Technology has outpaced our laws and our social ability to adapt fully. And the fact is that these days, everyone wants to own us. Facebook wants to own us. Google wants to own us. Microsoft wants to own us. Do you notice how these days when you surf to new websites that require login, they want you to log in with your Facebook password?